Well, look, thank you very much for the intro. It's a unique experience you've got today with this notion of kicking off our partnership with a webinar. I guess there's some traps and there's some advantages to the webinar thing. One of the advantages is that, for instance, like we'll record this session, so if there's anyone who misses the session today, or if there's any part of this that you want to go back over and have a look at, then you're welcome to. The trap, I guess, is that you can kind of tend to feel like you're watching a TV show. So there's a tendency sometimes not to step up, not to treat it like a conversation. And I want you to, I guess, just make as an adult learner a decision right now to be an active adult learner in this environment. So yes, it helps if we're not sort of chatting in the background, because I certainly can't catch you and tell you off or use any sort of secret clever behaviour management technique that I might try to deploy to get you to engage. Your engagement today is absolutely your choice. So if you choose to pay strong attention today without stepping up and without sort of contributing to the conversation, that's fine. That's absolutely your choice. But I want you to also know that you do have the choice to become involved in the conversation today as well, and to make contributions to it. I'll use the webinar features that are available to us to maximise the chance of that. So you'll notice that occasionally from time to time through the webinar today, what I will do is I'll pause and I'll switch to a timer being on the screen. And so it might be just a 1 minute or even a 3 minute chat, or even I'm actually big on giving you sometimes something interesting to talk about, just letting you have a 2 or 3 minute argument at your table about it, just to make sense of it before we move on to the next component of what we're talking about. But I also want you to know there's some other functionality as well that would allow you to get involved. One is that this GoToWebinar, if you haven't used it before, I can see that I can see the attendees, so I know that we've got one attendee signed on in the big room today with lots of people there, but I can see other people involved as well. They're perhaps in other offices, or they're off-site and they're accessing the webinar today, which is fantastic. So I want you all to know that you can ask questions verbally. So if you've got something you want to ask, whether you're in the big room or you're somewhere else, if you look on the GoToWebinar control panel, you'll see a hand function. It looks like just the palm of a hand. And if you just walk up to the lappy and just go and hover on that hand and press it, I'll see your hand go up, just like an old school classroom. And I can unmute you, provided you're not on a device. And then as James has just jumped in with here, he's asked, can we type a question? Yes, you can. So if you're feeling that, I am acutely aware of the discomfort that some people have about having their own voice recorded and potentially played back and heard by somebody else. So if you want to type a question about the content that we're talking about today, then by all means, there's a chat box there that depends on the version of software you've got, but there's usually a question box and sometimes a chat box as well. I'd recommend using the question box, and I will periodically from time to time go and check out the question box so that we can move forward, and just, I guess, so that we can discuss things that will allow this to not be a generic presentation, but that will be a little more tailored, a little more contextual for Lithgow High. First of all, I guess I'm starting this webinar today by allowing you to see my mug. I felt that it was a little unfair. I'm going to transition shortly into a voiced PowerPoint situation and work through a slide deck that I'm also going to provide you with after today. But I wanted to, I felt it was unfair for me to say that what I'm going to do is provide you with a voiced PowerPoint but not allow you to meet the person you're going to work with. I'm going to talk shortly about how important it is that we have a really strong and really connected working relationship, and basically because most people tell me that you can't successfully build a great culture around a school unless you make relationships a focus. So that's kind of a really great motherhood statement, but I'm big on, I guess I'm often speaking to the notion that there are two types of relationship builders in schools. There are the people that I call the blind builders. They're the people who build relationships just because they feel nice. And I guess I could go down that path of just trying to be friends with everybody. And we know those teachers that sort of sometimes fall for that trap. I reckon I've fallen for it from time to time as well. You can sort of smell the incense burning from their classrooms, and get the feeling that everyone's sitting around singing Kumbaya all day, but there's not a lot of learning getting done. And I get that can be a nice place to be in, but the fun wears off after a while. The type of relationship builder that I both admire and aspire to be is what I call a lever puller. And that's someone who builds relationships because they're going to almost manipulatively use those relationships, leverage those relationships, pull that lever to get young people, and in our case, to get each other to step up to higher levels of performance. When I say that my job is to come along and sort of help encourage you towards higher levels of performance, it can be a bit dangerous. I'm going to do a couple of dangerous things today, but that's okay. Because I'm giving the impression, I guess, that my job is to come in and tell you how to suck eggs, and that's definitely not the where I come in with. In fact, where I come in is my background is that I'm a former school principal myself. I'm a former primary school principal, and I'm a Victorian, so unfortunately a Mexican from south of the border. But I did my time as a principal and school leader further north than you in Darwin, in a couple of really tricky places. And it really got me fascinated around school culture and what I mean by school culture. I'll talk to that in just a moment. But what I do know is that school culture can't be improved by coming in and telling people the way that they need to do things better. It can't be done through PD alone. It can't be done through just administering higher expectations. What you need to do is to partner effectively and provide high levels of support if you want people to transform or to change the way that they practice. So I want you to know two things about our partnership before I switch to PowerPoint. Number one is that if at any time over the next 3 years, and that's how long we're planning to work together, because we know that you can't enhance or transform culture quickly, over that period of time, if any of you feel that I'm a PD provider, then I'm not doing my job. So my job's not to come along and stand in front of you and tell you what to do. My job's not to appear on a webinar and tell you what you're doing wrong or what you're doing right. My job is not to judge or assess in any way. My job is to help you to be a critical friend to your school while you get done what you want to do over the next 3 years, while you implement your programs, while you improve student learning outcomes. And I need to do it two ways. Number one is I need to make sure that every single educator, and I'm going to use the word educator or teacher quite generically, even though I know I've got people in multiple roles today. My job is to try and help every single educator to feel more effective, to feel like you go home every night feeling that you got somewhere. I often call it that I'm trying to eliminate flat forehead syndrome, the feeling that you're banging your head against the brick wall. And I think that comes from a gap between your purpose and your practice. We want to narrow that gap. We want you to go, actually, I practice in a way that enacts what I believe about working with young people. And the second thing I want to do is to reduce your stress levels. Now, I actually explicitly state that my work is about trying to help schools and educators within those schools to sleep better at night. And so anything that I do with you, I want you to know that everything we do is a supportive piece of work. It's to help you do what you already have to do with increased effect and with less stress. And I hope that sounds okay. I hope that sounds like it's going to work for you. So I might just do the switch, if that's all right. And I'll do it while you have your first 1 minute conversation at your table. So 1 minute conversation at your table, completely about how does that all sound to you, the notion of us working together over the next 3 years. 1 minute starts now. Have a chat. thanks, folks. Really appreciate you going quiet on me there. I can tell that you're well drilled on what you need to do to make this work for you. All right, let's get into it. So what we're saying is that we're going to build a restorative school culture. I met your leadership team a few months ago now at a PD event that I ran in Sydney, and it was a pleasure to work with them for the day. And I think the thing that came out of our conversations is that when it comes to working on restorative practices, even as a lever or as a methodology for building a strong school culture, that language has to be paid attention to right at the start there, that what we're here to do is to do restorative practices because it gets us the culture that we're looking for. So if I were to ask you right now, and I'll get you to, obviously I can't see you, but if you were to just glance around at the other people at your table or that are in your room, and if I put that notion of school culture on the table, and could I just get you to put your hand up if you think that the culture of a school is important? Do that for me straight away. Now, my guess is that we had a lot of people put their hands up at that time. All right, so what I'm going to do again now is get you to have a conversation at your table now about what are you talking about. When I say school culture is important and everybody puts their hand up, I'm often pushing people a little further then and saying, okay, so if you've got your hand up, just keep your hand up for a minute because I'm going to randomly select one of you to come out the front of the room and to tell everybody what you mean by school culture. What's the correct definition of school culture? And a lot of hands go down really quickly. And I'm often making the gag that we turn into, I don't know if you've ever seen the great Australian movie, The Castle, but the lawyer in it, Dennis Denuto, when he's asked to describe the Constitution, and he says that, it's the vibe, it's Marbo, and he's not quite sure what we're really talking about. Now, my point here is that if culture is as important as we all say it is, does it not make sense that we should have some agreed definition on it? So here's your next 2-minute conversation at your table. What do you mean? What do you mean when we're talking about school culture? What do you think is the correct definition of school culture? Quick chat about that for 2 minutes. Go. All right, thanks everyone. Appreciate the conversation. It's a really rich topic that I know that there's almost a temptation for me here to say that I could just let you talk about that for the next hour or so, and I will have got through this really easily. I guess the only thing that I'm hoping that you would have recognised is that a variety of definitions around school culture makes it difficult for us to work on. because we're sort of pulling the boat in a variety of different directions. So what I would like to do is for us to begin by getting clear about our working definition of school culture. So here's what I believe about culture. I believe that culture is a behavioural set. It's a big nebulous ball of all of the behaviours that are contributed by the three key stakeholder groups in a school community. So that's the staff, it's the student, and it's the parents or the carers, as the case may be. So there's an interesting phenomenon, though, when we have a look at that big ball of behaviours, though. What we find is there's two kind of subsets that sit within them. I like to think of them as piles of behaviours. So there's a pile of behaviours that we encourage. And they're the behaviours that we might, for instance, say, yep, that's fantastic, we really like that, we value that. It may even line up with one of our school's stated values. We may even reward it intrinsically with some sort of certificate or other recognition. And we say, good on you, pat on the back, we like that, do it again, do it more creatively, do it more often. Great, we would like more of those behaviours. But whether we like it or not, there is also another set of behaviours that comprise our culture, and it is the behaviours that we tolerate. And they are the behaviours that exist within our culture because we haven't yet perhaps found the skill, the will, or the time to be able to tackle those behaviours with a repeated methodology so that we can move them one at a time from the tolerate pile to the encourage pile. Schools with strong, relational, sustainable cultures tend to be those with just a bigger pile of behaviours in the encourage pile than the tolerate pile. And they tend to be ones that have said we have a methodology for being able to improve the behaviour ratio in our school. And all we're saying is that let's choose a repeatable methodology for that called restorative practice. What I think you'll discover as we go here is that I think that all of you will have had some sort of filter around restorative practices before. Everywhere I go, every school that I work with, I find that there's a different filter, a different pre-existing view of what restorative practices is all about. Some people think it's a behaviour management approach. Some people think that it's something you do when a serious incident happens. Some people think that it's about running circles, and all of that is kind of true. But if you're serious about it becoming culture, it has to impact the way that people interact with each other at the very informal end, as well as when something serious happens. So if we're going to get clear around culture, while I think that the picture on your screen here for my title screen is a really aspirational one, everyone's getting along really well, and the teacher here has been able to do something dangerous with chemicals, he's been able to turn his back on a few students. I'm a little dodgy on that young kid, on that kid there on the left. I think that he's right up on the edge there. I think he's up to something. But anyway, this is a really aspirational picture that I'm sure has just been completely set up for a photographer. I want to make it clear that when we are talking about culture, we need to get a little more real than this. The thing that I think is most missing from this picture is the struggle, and it is the emotion that comes along with the struggle. So I think that a better title slide might have been this one. There's several things that are wrong with this picture. Clearly, there's a blackboard and the classroom's way too neat, but it's the look on the teacher's face. Look on the teacher's face that does it for me. And this is what deprives us of the opportunity to be consistent. Most people, when I ask them, do you think when it comes to improving behaviour in a school, improving engagement and thereby improving the culture of the school, do you think consistency is important? And everyone says yes. But if I may, I'd love to tell you right now what's the very worst way, just to start off, that you can achieve consistency. The worst way, the way that never works, and it's to try. And it's because you will constantly be at the whim of the wide variety and awful fluctuations of emotions that people exist in a school environment every single day. I'm wondering, even if you think now, if I was to run my first webinar session with you at 9 o'clock in the morning, would you engage differently than with me starting at 3:30 in the afternoon? A lot of people say yes. If I was to run it on a Monday compared to a Friday, would you engage differently? And most people think yes. If I was to run this session in February compared to, say, November, would you engage? And what about on a payday? Would you have an extra step in your spring in your step on payday? And some people go, no, I don't, because it's all gone before I get to look at the bank account anyway. But there are always things going on in our lives that draw us away from consistency, and most of it has something to do with emotion. And in the classroom, where you're trying to get young people to do things that they would prefer not to, so you're trying to get them to learn about quadratic equations when they would prefer to be on an Xbox, there is undoubtedly going to be some negative affect, some negative emotion experienced as well. And the question around consistency is not whether we can try to be consistent. It's about whether we can agree on what are the strategies, what are the words, what are the approaches we're going to use when emotion comes along. Can we decide in advance what to do about that? So when it comes to culture, and it comes to the notion of thinking about language and thinking about words and thinking about approaches and strategies, I think that one of the most important things we need to do is to get clear about the muscle with which we build culture, with which we learn to behave, and that's the brain. Now, if you have been in a school in Australia in the last 3 to 5 years, then somebody has come along at some point and hit you over the brain with the Carol Dweck stick, with the growth mindset stick. And I want to say first up that Dweck's work is highly admirable. There is some really great stuff in there. But even Dweck has had to address herself that a really basic or a really rudimentary look at her work has resulted in some people not having a depth of knowledge that is dangerous. And what it means is that we've had people running around, little armies running around Australia going, yes, I saw a Carol Dweck growth mindset TED talk for 3.5 minutes, and I've decided that I'm either a left brainer or a right brainer. So they have eliminated from possibility the option to use half of their brain, and it's completely bonkers. So Dweck has had to address that herself. Your ability to use both the left and right side of your brain, whether you think you're inclined to creativity or big picture thinking or detail orientation, is quite adept. You're good at all three. Your tendency for one over the other is actually quite slight. So we want to get clear about using both hemispheres of our brain really effectively. And it leads me to think that one of the better views of the brain when we're starting to get clear around culture and the way that emotion interacts with thinking in a school environment is to look from the side rather than to look from the top down. When we look from the side, I think we see two components of the brain that are kind of important and two that are kind of interesting. So the two that are interesting I would call the cerebellum and the stem. Now, I may be about to offend a couple of science teachers in the room with my layman understanding of the brain, but the way that it's been described to me by a couple of behavioural psychologists is that the cerebellum is the part of our brain that is responsible. It's kind of the computer that controls the machine. So it's the part of our brain that allows me to look at my right hand and say close, and it does, and that's pretty cool. But it's quite exhausting across the length and breadth of a day to have this computer working in overdrive to control my body and all of the things that it needs to do in a full day of working and living. And this is why either the brain or the body or both starts to get tired by the end of the day. It's got so much to do. And eventually, this is fundamentally one of the reasons that we need sleep, is that we need to recharge both the cerebellum and its interactivity with the machine in order for us to be able to get up and go again the next day. But of course, we can't completely shut down. So we can't just shut down the computer and the machine because that looks like death and it's really bad for learning. So we outsource the automatic functioning of the machine to the stem of our brain. And there's I guess if you've seen any of the controversy around stem cell research, it's because scientists wig out completely over the cells in the stem of the brain. They're amongst some of the most extraordinary cells that have been discovered anywhere in the universe. And it's because they can actually keep you alive without any conscious input from the rest of the brain. So it does things like it controls things like your breathing, like your heartbeat, and even today, while you're in a professional learning environment, wherever it is that you may be, the stem of your brain is controlling things like your blinking. So I don't know if you can imagine how hard it would be for you to concentrate today if you had to remember to blink. I have a very simple pedagogy for working with adult learners, and it's try to make important points. And if it's important, you need to tell some sort of story help people wrap context around it. So I could get halfway through a reasonably interesting story, you forget to blink, you go blind and scream, and it's, again, not really great for your engagement or learning. So we need to be really clear and careful about knowing that these parts of our brain are actually doing us an incredible service and look after our brain health so they can. They're kind of interesting. When it comes to the learning environment, though, I'm a firm believer that there are two parts of the brain that are, just trying to get my screen back here, but two parts of the brain that I think are just critical for every educator, in fact, every parent to know about. The first is the neocortex. So whether you are a left brainer or a right brainer, you're talking about the neocortex of your brain. It's the largest part of your brain. It was the last to evolve, last part of your brain to evolve. But in human beings, it has evolved to such a level that we are the alpha species on the planet. It can do things no other species is capable of doing with their brain and their own neocortex or thinking centres. So whether you're left or right, it's responsible for your problem solving, it's responsible for your thinking, for your processing. As you can see on the screen, logic, reasoning and language all happens across the neocortex in different componentry. And that's really cool, you know, because there are some things that, like I mentioned a moment ago, that the neocortex can do in us that other animals can't do. So, for instance, one's insight. So you can reflect today, for instance, when you walk to the car at the end of our session today, you can think to yourself, did I pay attention? You know, did I give myself the best chance to get something out of a 90-minute webinar this afternoon? And you can also, that's called using insight, and then you can use a thing called foresight. And to be honest, Anne and the leadership team today have used foresight in asking me to come along. The truth is you could be doing other things today. You could be planning your lessons for tomorrow. You could be running a homework club and helping some kids extra helping some kids with their learning that need it. But what they have said is we're going to put a little bit of time aside now, and we're going to delay gratification for that time in the hope that later on we'll get that return later. And very few species on the planet are able to contemplate doing such a thing. So your neocortex is incredible. And I'm wondering if you could just give a little nod to the people on your table if you think that what I'm about to say next stands to truth. Would you agree that kids are easier to teach when they're using their neocortex in the classroom? I'm anticipating nods, just to make sure I know if everybody's going, no, I don't think so. Would you agree also, give a little nod if you agree again, would you agree that teaching is easier when you're able to think straight? When your neocortex is working well. Yep, and most people agree with that one too. And I guess the last one I often say is, would you agree that parents are easier to talk to when they're thinking rather than feeling? And the truth is that that's the case, very much the case too, but we often don't encounter them in that situation. And it's because there's another part of our brain that keeps getting in the way, and we call this the limbic system. The limbic system, essentially, if we wanted to boil it down to really basic terms, the neocortex's role is to think, and the limbic system's role is to feel. It's our emotional centre. It was the first part of our brain to develop. And the limbic system has evolved to ensure that all of our emotions, positive and negative, are there to help us to be able to survive and to socialise. So every single emotion we experience is there to help us to be able to do one of those two things. Even the really nasty ones, which is, which is frustrating. So, things that we don't want to feel, but we have to because we need them. So fear, I'm wondering if you can think about fear as a nasty emotion, isn't it? But then if we ask ourselves the question, I don't like fear, but what do we need it for? Then we tend to say things like, well, I think fear's there to help us to be able to identify risk. It's there to help us stay safe. And you're absolutely right. What fear does is what happens when we experience emotion is that we interrupt the use of the neocortex. So what happens is that there's a little beast inside the limbic system called amygdala. And scientists over the last 20 years have become increasingly fascinated by. And amygdala's job is to work a bit like the traffic cop in the brain. It decides whether you're going to think or feel. I'm wondering whether you can imagine or contemplate this statement. Have you noticed that as human beings, we kind of suck at doing both at the same time? We're not very good at thinking or feeling. We're doing one or the other. And that's because amygdala stops you from being able to get full access to both your feelings and your thinking at exactly the same time. This is really important. Fear is a really good example of that. This evolved for us from the cave many thousands of years ago, when we might be sitting around having a lovely night, and then in the only entry and exit to our cave, a saber-toothed tiger appears. And at that point, we don't need to be demonstrating to the other people around us our brilliant neocortex. Now, the last thing anybody in that cave needs is you looking over at people going, it appears we have an issue with a saber-toothed tiger. I believe that there are 4 options available to us. We should draw them in the sand, we should debate their merits, and we should determine which is the most appropriate course of action. Because by now, there's been a very important event happen, and that's called death. Saber-toothed tiger has taken its first victim. So neocortex is awesome but slow, and amygdala interrupts it so that we can be less brilliant but fast. So amygdala's job is to sort of look at neocortex and say, look at the saber-toothed tiger and say, neocortex, I love you, big fella, but just grab a seat for a minute. I need to draw up the correct emotion here. And the correct emotion, clearly when you see a saber-toothed tiger in your presence, is fear. Because fear triggers something for us. It triggers what we call our flight or fight mechanism. So the truth is that at this point it's time to grab a spear or run. One or the other, get it done, have a go, try to survive the situation. And it's only later on that we're able to switch back to doing our thinking when the threat has passed. And this is something that's been happening in our life, that's happening not just from the cave, this is something that's happening in our lives every single day. I'm wondering if anyone in the room can imagine the last time they had a fight with a partner. And if you're like me, one of the things that I'm often pointing out to my lovely wife, Anthea, and we've been together for 23 years, and we have what I would call a fantastic marriage. But she has a head start in certain areas. She knows when we're going to have an argument 5 minutes before I do. And when the argument comes in our marriage, what happens is that the amygdala goes, rightio, away we go, and I start to feel certain emotions associated with being in that argument. When I let my limbic system choose my words for me, it doesn't work out so good. I don't know about you, but I wonder how many of you have ever walked away from an argument with your partner, and about 5 minutes later you've gone, oh, I should have said that. And what that's about is that once you were in the argument, you didn't think of that brilliant zinger, that wonderful line that would allow you to win the argument by 100 points. It's only when you walk away from the argument that amygdala looks around and says, she's gone. You're allowed to think again. That the neocortex kicks back in and conjures the correct language for you. In fact, if you're like me, you probably walk away from the argument and say, okay, this is I probably said a couple of things in there that I shouldn't have said, and I now need to clean up. What are we on about in our partnership? What we want to do is to be able to get to the neocortex. We want to upload, if you will, to the neocortex as many of the 2 things that neocortex is fantastic with, and the first one is language. Language, when it comes to culture, is supremely important. I'll talk more about that in just a minute. But it's supremely important because, I don't know about you, but when emotion comes into the classroom, when I have a lesson that I felt was really well planned, but I had it with 8B, and 8B tend to not care about the level of planning that I've gone to, and things are going upside down and a little haywire, I found myself standing at the front of that class thinking, you know what, I have no idea what to say. I can't find the words. I know the things that make me limbic when I'm in the learning environment. For instance, one of them is students who yell out. The students who constantly yell out in the classroom gets to me. So I've already decided. I've plugged the words into my neocortex so I don't have to think of them when the emotion of that comes along. And I will say to that student, and I know that this is going to sound slightly ridiculous, but I will look at that student and I give them the tiniest bit of eye contact. Because I know that when students yell out, that the currency that they're deploying is often attention. They're looking for eyeballs. So I'll give them just a couple of seconds to let them know that it's there, but it's not worth the effort. And so unfortunately, I can't listen to people who shout out, but I will listen to Barry over here, who's sitting exactly the way I've requested. And I just say that over and over again, and it becomes so boring and so unattentive to the behaviour that eventually I get a reduction in frequency and severity. You'll notice that I didn't say a miracle. You get a reduction in frequency and severity. And it comes by choosing to put the right words in advance. So what I need in my marriage with Anthea is I need a fairy who will come along and tell me that, Adam, there's a fight about to happen in 5 minutes. Anthea knows. No, you need to know too. And these are the 3 sentences you'll need to remember in order to have a chance in that encounter. That's what I really need to happen. So we're going to upload to the neocortex the right words. We're going to start thinking about the language that we are inputting to the culture of our school. And we're also going to upload, the other thing that neocortex is fantastic with is pictures. It's, and simple pictures. Now, I'm wondering if any of you can, off the top of your head, conjure in your head a picture of, for instance, say your grandmother's backyard when you were 5 years old. I know I can. I can actually remember standing by the window, standing by the back door. I can remember looking at the window and seeing the sticker there for the AFL team, the Footscray Bulldogs on the window. I can see that it's peeling and it's been heat and light faded. I can see the 5 pavers that run from the grass through the grass, hunking into that couch that take you to the Hills Hoist clothesline. And I can see the pink peg bag that hangs on the handle of that clothesline. I can see it there. And what we're going to do is upload a really simple model to our neocortex that we can use to reflect. A lot of people tell me that reflection is really important for educators, and I'm going to provoke a little bit here and say I don't think you are reflective unless you reflect on something, unless you've got a mirror to look into. And I think that would help us to achieve consistency if we were to all use the same kind of mirror, to all use the same kind of model for the way that we're going to reflect. And that's kind of one of the key intentions around working restoratively, and it's one of the key intentions about working on culture. 2-minute chat at your table. What went into your head there? What are the things that you're knowing, thinking, feeling, deciding, wondering about the way the brain works in the learning environment? Quick 2-minute chat at your table. All right, thank you, everyone, and I do mean that when I say thank you. It's a unique and kind of weird experience, isn't it? This whole webinar thing. I certainly know that the biggest challenge I face is usually that I've got absolutely no idea whether people in the room are rolling their eyes or whether they're smiling. So thank you for sticking with me on that and having a bit of a crack at it. So the reason that language for me is so important in terms of school culture is it's the only thing we know that is both an input and an output. Now, from an input point of view, what we mean is that when it comes to leading school culture, and can I say that's what every single person on this webinar does. When it comes to leading program in schools, so the executive of the school has a higher influence. That's their job. That is to determine what programs are run in the school. So whether it's the way that we teach maths or whether it's the way that we do social skilling in the school, if they choose a program and it's going to be run, it basically happens. They provide the training, they provide the resources, and they provide the expectation that that gets done. When it comes to culture, it doesn't matter so much what the executive choose. What matters is what the people who lead the culture say, which is in a school environment, it's the adults in that space. Their responsibility around culture gets flattened from the executive and gets spread collectively across the entire adult population in the school culture. So what we need to recognise when it comes to the language that we input is that it is a choice. We're not victims of our language, and if we can think and become aware of the words that we're choosing to put into the culture, that there is plenty of opportunity to change things, and it begins with making a decision that we're going to say and do different things. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that in just a minute. And there's plenty of practice that you can get. So I think what you'll discover when we talk about effective language is that the opportunities we've got to use that language are just wide and extensive. It's quite crazy how many chances you have to impact your language in a school environment. And the fascinating thing about language, and when it comes to its connection to culture, is that language is also the most important key output of culture. What we mean by that is that we're actually, over time, we start to hear language of the other people in the culture. For instance, in a school situation, it's all students. For instance, say an Indigenous culture, we're often talking about the language that's inputted by the elders, and the output of that being the language that's spoken by young people in that culture. I know that having spent such a long time in the Northern Territory, I've had conversations with key Indigenous people, from people like Yalmay Yunupingu, who's the wife of the late Mandawar Yunupingu, who was Australian of the Year and also himself a former school principal. And I employed Yalmay for a while and was just delighted that every now and then I got to have an Australian of the Year and lead singer of the Year in my office for a couple of hours to chat about language culture and what that should mean for me as a principal of a school with 60% Indigenous kids. And Yalmay and Mandawar both articulated to me that they said they think this is the key reason that they're worried about the Indigenous culture, is that the elders have stopped inputting the right stories, and young people have lost track of how to talk like they belong to that culture. And what we're looking for in a school community is an output in terms of language of young people who are empathic, who think before they act, who demonstrate respect. And can I say here that respect's a fascinating topic. I'll talk more to that as we move through this the next 45 minutes or so. But respect and certainly empathy are things that you just can't teach formally. Yet we've been walking that path in schools for quite a long time now. We've decided that if we determine our values as being respect or even empathy, that somehow if we put those on letterheads and on signs around the school, it'll trickle down and affect people's behaviour. You just don't learn respect that way. You learn it by people who lead the culture speaking in a respectful way, and two, the behaviours that comprise respect with monotonous regularity. You learn restraint because you learn to think before you act. You learn self-regulation because you've got a healthy understanding of negative affect when you experience it. You realise, to be really honest, that negative affect is just a signal to take action. When we feel fear, it is a signal: take action, grab a spear or run straight away. And the restorative methodology is built on a really deep examination of one emotion that feels really awful, and it's called shame. And it's nasty stuff. The literature is that we experience shame more acutely and deeply and heavily than we experience even things like pain and grief. And it feels awful. But like every other emotion, it has a job. And shame's job is to enact conscience, which means what we want is for our young people to learn that when I experience the shame of having done the wrong thing, it's not a signal to hide, it's not a signal to blame others, it's not a signal to lie, it's a signal to take action. And when they do that, they learn a really important skill of self-regulation, which in turn develops a creativity that drives moral growth. This is why this culture thing is so important, and this is why we've made the mistake of trying to, for instance, around topics like bullying, where we've tried to deprogram bullying out of our young people at our own peril and at our own waste of time. The global count on anti-bullying programs now sits at around 9,000. So 9,000 times we've tried it. If one of them worked, then we could have just grabbed that program, plonked it in our schools, run it once a term on a Wednesday afternoon, and we'd be right as rain when it comes to bullying. Bullying is not a behavioural issue. You can't deprogram that behaviour out of your kids. Bullying is a cultural phenomenon. where that kind of behaviour around where power is valued, is encouraged, then we're going to experience more bullying. Where collaboration, where empathy are encouraged through monotonous regularity, through language, then what we find is that bullying is reduced. There's a great study done by the University of London, and they looked into the way that they looked into 1,378 schools who were kind of, I keep using the wrong analogy here, but they were punching above their weight when it came to bullying. And what they found was that the most common factor in all of those 1,378 schools, the number one common factor, was a restorative ethos of culture. The Greek meaning behind the word ethos being everything you say and everything you do. So it's not about whether you do it as a behaviour management program when something bad happens. It's not about whether you do the occasional circle. It's about whether it becomes part of the ethos and culture, and that's what we're going to be serious about. That's me priming you over the last 45 minutes or so for not only this session today, but for an exciting journey. So first practical tip today. Priming is a behaviour and language strategy that you can use to get better behaviour in your classroom. I guess, I don't know about you, I'm a keen observer of human behaviour. I just love people watching. So I watch people at airports, and this kid here that you can see on the screen is my poster child for the kind of priming that you see in language that happens at supermarkets. Priming effectively is the language of using words, the behaviours you wish to see rather than those you don't. So I'm often, I think the best example is, if I used to go for a walk with Anthea through a park that's nearby to where we live in Victoria, there used to be a sign that said "keep off the grass," and I just couldn't help myself. I had to, there was something special about that grass, and Anthea used to roll her eyes because every time I'd get up on the grass and I'm stomping on it and I'm kicking a foot in it with my son, and I just had to know. And as far as I'm concerned, it's not my fault. But they put the idea in my head, because the sign mentioned the grass, and I just had to go there. What we noticed over time was that the people that run the park and garden nearby, they changed the sign. And this is the case for most parks and gardens around Australia that you'll see these days, is they have all changed the signs, and the signs don't tend to speak to the grass anymore. They actually talk to what they want you to do, they assume you're going to do it, and they thank you for it. So the sign now, when we walk through that park, says, "Thank you for staying on the path." And I'm working along holding hands with Anthea doing what I'm told and sort of looking at the sign going, no worries. And she's rolling her eyes, you've got to be kidding me. But the truth is they were able to impact, if not the way I behave, then the way that I think before I behave, by just speaking to the behaviours that they wish to see rather than the ones that they don't. It's the fundamental reason in language that don't work. This kid is in the supermarket in aisle 3 because mum or dad, as they walked into the aisle, has looked down at him and said, "Now, Billy, do not touch all the biscuits in this aisle today." And what has Billy heard? "Touch biscuits today." And he's throwing all the tiny teddies and the wagon wheels into the trolley. Mum or dad's ripping them out, putting them back on the shelf, and before you know it, you've got this kid chucking a tantrum in aisle 3. I certainly have done it as a teacher. I remember a group of boys walking past me when they went to go outside to lunchtime. I think they were about probably in about year 7, I think, and I said to them, "Hey, you blokes, none of that fighting like we had yesterday, all right?" And they looked at me and they looked up to the left while they were remembering and up to the right while they were creating, and they went, "What?" "Oh yeah, that's right." And they laughed and ran to the exact location that the fight happened yesterday. Why'd they do it? Because I put the idea. If I had only had said to those boys, hey, you blokes, enjoy that game of cricket today, can't wait to find out who took the most poles, then I may want them to behave differently. And I hope you're starting to realise that the opportunities to shift the language away from the don'ts that we use in classrooms towards the things that we do wish to see in our young people are abundant. They're absolutely everywhere. And if we seize those opportunities, we start to change culture, which is an incredibly exciting thing to do. I also want to prime you for our partnership a little bit just for a moment. So what I want you to know is that we're going to have a series of these webinars leading up to me coming to visit you for the very first time at the beginning of next year. So we're going to be getting together a few times between now and the end of the year. We just took a punt, basically, that we thought that there was a healthy impatience across your school to do work like this. And so we're going to be doing a lot of different things together. We're going to be working together in this kind of environment. We're also going to be working in your classrooms. We're going to be working with your parents. I'm going to be working with the leaders of the school, and we're going to be fully resourcing this so that you can feel really supported to make even the smallest shifts in your behaviour. So we're going to be, to be honest, you're probably going to be, sick of the sight and sound of me at some stage, but I want you to know that this is a fully supported shift. I say these things around priming even as though it's a really flippant and easy thing to do and you'll all just do it really quickly. But the truth is your defaults around saying don't are incredibly strong, and you deserve a lot of support and help to be able to do the thinking required to have your language and your defaults changed to new ones. I figure if we're going to work together that we should have a relationship as well. So what I'm going to do is to just, over the next minute or so, give you, I'm going to tell you 3 things about myself. First of all, this is Victoria Falls in Africa, a fabulous place. And I went there with my darling wife, Anthea. We went there, we were going way back now, more than 20 years ago, and we went there because we were going to go on a fantastic holiday before we started a family, because apparently great advice is to start a family with a $20,000 credit card debt. Not smart, but anyway, we had a great time. And this is where the Zambezi River cascades through the African countryside and carves a line between 2 countries, between Zimbabwe and Zambia. It's called the world's largest natural bungee jump from the middle of that bridge, and it's just extraordinary. It's about 330 feet above the water below, so more than 100 metres. And I bungee jumped off that bridge, so that was pretty exciting. So that's the first fact I wanted to share with you about me. The second fact is it was taken at this time. The picture you can see here is the closing ceremony of the LA Olympics in 1984. In 1984, I was a 12-year-old boy growing up in Frankston, and if anyone knows Frankston in Victoria, it's got a reputation for a reason. And I had a fantastic little mullet sprouting out the back, and I went to school that day, came home with a mate called Matt, and the Olympic Games were on, so we watched a little bit of it on the telly, and then Matt said to me, "Hey Voidy, we should go outside and we should play the Olympic Games." And I said yes, and we did the only event that sprang to mind for 2 12-year-olds from Frankston, and that was javelin. So we found a pole that my mum used to pull down the blinds with a hook on the end, and Matt threw his, and I marked in the lawn where with a golf tee where Matt's javelin had landed, and then I had my go. And I remember as I let it go thinking, I've got this. It even spun like a javelin. It just didn't wobble like a mad stick. And I thought, I've got him. I'm going to win this. And at that moment, my 5-year-old sister ran out the back door. And I don't know if it was good luck or bad luck, but I got her in the foot. And 8 seconds later, I was in big mobs of trouble. In fact, 3 about me involves this rascal. Possibly, for me, undoubtedly the best cricketer I've ever seen play the game. One of the more ordinary humans on the planet, I think, but an amazing cricketer. And I was an up-and-coming cricketer. I'm a cricket tragic. I've played all my life. Still running around in the seconds and thirds for Dramana Cricket Club down here as a 47-year-old. And back when I was about 15 to 16, I was a bit of an up-and-coming fast bowler. And I got myself picked in the Dowling Shield, which is an under-16 competition. I get to play on the big district grounds in Melbourne with one of the big district clubs. And my mum, who was a scorer for us that week, I played for South Melbourne, just a few years ago found the scorebook that she managed to somehow conveniently not hand in after the Dowling Shield week. And she found a game where I'd played against St Kilda Cricket Club, who had a young fellow playing for them called Shane Keith Warren. And I was very delighted to see in the score sheet that I had made 16 runs and that Warren had not gotten me out. Very exciting stuff. So there's 3 facts about me. You get to have a 1-minute argument at your table about which one of those 3 things I just lied to you about. One was an absolute barefaced lie. But you know what? In that 1 minute, I want you to declare which one you think I'm lying about really quickly, because there's a bigger question at play here, and that is why would a ridiculous little game like 2 truths and a lie that many of you would have known before, why that could be useful in terms of building culture, and in particular a culture that makes bullying harder to thrive. What do you think that's all about? I'm going to give you 1 minute to have that discussion. There you go. All right. Well, the first thing you want to do, you probably won't concentrate any further unless I tell you the answer. The lie was the Shane Warne one. Yes, give yourself a cheer if you got that one right. I was shattered. I was the last kid cut from the South Melbourne Dowling Shield squad, and I had to, my emotionally detached father didn't understand why I sat in the back of the Kingswood all the way home instead of the front, and it's because I was crying because I had to go to school rather than play cricket for a week. And some of you may have got the clue in there, which was that if I was 12 in 1984, despite the work that Warnie has had done to try and make you think otherwise, he's actually a couple of years older than me, so I wouldn't have got to play against him anyway. I'm wondering if you can think about what you had going on there in terms of why this is a useful activity in terms of building a culture where bullying finds it hard to thrive. And the truth here is that we already know some of the things that exist culturally in schools where bullying finds it hard to thrive. In fact, quite a few studies have revealed that the number one protective factor against knowing things about against bullying happening is knowing things about each other. Yet, I wonder if you can think about what our default reaction has been to two students who might be in a bullying spiral relationship in a classroom over the last 150 years or so. And it tends to be to divide them, to separate them. I'm wondering if in your own language, because I'm going to say this right now, I certainly have. I wonder if you've ever heard yourself in your own language say to a student, why don't you just stay away from him for a while? And what we're doing is we're denying these students the one opportunity that is research proven to give them the best fighting chance to resolve the issues that they have between each other. It doesn't mean that one person's not more at fault than another in that situation. It doesn't mean that a victim, for instance, needs to be punished by being in an uncomfortable situation. It's just saying that when we feel negative affect, we take action, and we try to choose the action that gives young people the best chance of the problem behaviour, reducing in terms of frequency and severity. So what we're saying is, can we find a repeatable and safe methodology for being able to bring these students together? We're going to do it by examining our own commitment as teachers. And for me, a really genuinely committed teacher is not necessarily one who works the hardest or the longest. I think they are the wrong rulers for being able to measure the commitment of a teacher. I think that a great teacher does what these Italian teachers that you can see in this picture here are doing. They sit in small groups, they discuss practice, and they make important decisions about lines they're going to cross that they'll never go back over. They do that without shame. They don't think back on their old past practices, and I can tell you now, I can think of some weird ones. You know, I told a young man one day in a special school in my second year of teaching that if he continued with his rubbish attitude, he would have to end up in the bin with the rubbish. Smart language. Was proven to not be particularly smart when the principal arrived 5 minutes later. And I noticed that in her talking to me while she stood at the door that she was distracted by something over my shoulder. As I turned, I found young David standing there in the bin. He looked at the principal, looked at me and said, "Mr. Voigt told me I had to go in the bin." Yeah, that didn't work out so good. But you know what? I actually look back on it with not one skerrick of shame. I'm not worried about it. It's just a funny story. What would be shameful would be to learn that to not learn the lesson about how I can adjust my language, for instance, through some positive priming, to be able to make shifts that I want to be able to make shifts that get me a better chance of Dave doing the right thing. I love this picture because I think it's restorative in its nature. It's teachers who are sitting in a circle for a start, which means it's very difficult to tell who the leader in the group is. I love the fact that there's no table because that emphasises that the professional dialogue is the product. I just love the fact they're sitting in comfy chairs because what I think's going on is that their cerebellum isn't working overtime. They just get the chance to just sit and talk about practice, and when you get comfortable about practice, you can get comfortable about making improvements and to move away without shame from practices that aren't serving you the way that you want them to. So when we get together, we're going to have, there'll even be some postcards on the table. This will be where you'll take notes, and this will be the first postcard is how we can build a genuine commitment to constant improvement in our practice. The second thing we're going to look to do is to deploy practices that elevate levels of care, or if you will, levels of empathy in our students. And we're going to look at first of all, the language shifts are. So how is it that what would the work required be for us to be able to build an environment where our students are perhaps bucking the trend that a lot of educators tell me they're seeing? When I ask educators, do you get the feeling, do you get a hunch that students are a little more self-centered these days? That students are a little more interested in self rather than others these days? Everybody awkwardly kind of nods when I say that. They're awkward because there are exceptions. There certainly are some students out there with fantastic levels of empathy and community spirit. But on whole, we're kind of worried about it. And I share their worry and concern, but I'm also incredibly optimistic because I firmly believe that the ability to empathise is well evolved within the limbic system of every young person's brain that you work with. It's our job to put them in an environment where that empathy switch gets turned on, where they can understand and learn and have a decent emotional vocabulary to be able to get it the way that their behaviour has affected other people, and to see it as a signal when they get it wrong to take action and to do something about it. And then thirdly, we're going to work on how we can reconnect community with the school. I think that I'm often asking, and it's a bit of priming, I know, but when I ask people what they think has changed the most in schools in the last 30 years, it often comes down to the connection that parents have with the school. They feel like parents used to be trusting of the school. And I think that's true because I think the thing that's changed the most in schools in the last 30 years is that it used to be that if you got into trouble at school, you got into trouble twice. And it wasn't about the trouble. It was about the connection. It was about the partnership between home and school being defined by trust, such that we were even prepared to accept some dodgy practices like corporal punishment on either end. And when we left some of those dodgy practices behind, unfortunately, we threw out with it some of the trust. And it's about how we can reconnect with communities, because the truth is that parents didn't choose this. Parents didn't sit around en masse and decide we'd like a worse relationship with the school. Schools didn't choose this either. They didn't decide what we want is for our parents to attack us more than to support us. So we've got to ask ourselves occasionally, how'd that happen? And the truth is here that it's a media-driven phenomenon. If I were to tell you who I think would be on the poster about who's the enemy of school culture, I would say that it's Tracy Grimshaw. Because Tracy is going to send a message via a current affair into your family's lounge rooms this week that says, do not trust schools. You know, look at this nutter principal that I found down here that banned mobile phones, or won't let the students have earrings. And they get us they invite us into conflict over things that don't matter. And over time, if you repeat that conflict often enough and there's no resolution to that conflict, we learn not to trust each other. And it's ridiculous because parents don't send their kids to school for the amount of earrings they wear, or whether they're allowed to do handstands or not. They send their kids to school and they tell us this because they want their kid to get a decent education, and so that they can they'll refer to it often as social skills. They want them to be able to learn some social skills, and I call it citizen building. They want us to work with them to turn them into a decent citizen. When I say that to your parents, when I meet them, I know they'll nod. I know they'll go, yep, that's right, that's why we do that. And what we need to do is to get them back on the same page around those two important things and have them to forget all the other stuff that Tracy wants us in conflict about. So it's a communications imperative we have here, is can we let them know how damn good we are at those two things? You know, can we let them know about our expertise around teaching and learning? And can we let them know around about our expertise around social skilling? Because you know what, I think we tend to trust experts a little more. You know, well, I'm often saying when you go to a doctor's surgery, all of the certificates are up on the wall because they want you to have a moment where you go, this person knows what they're talking about, I better listen. And that's the kind of phenomena that we're going to look for by re-establishing a really strong connection with the broader community. So do me a favour, will you? When I do meet with your community, don't get me the choir. Don't get me the ones who always come to these things. Let's get a couple of the people who really need to be there, and let's see if we can start to flip them from being anchored on what you're trying to get done to being supporters of it. And so it gets us to bring us back to this notion of school culture. I want to ask questions like, can you define school culture? Can you think about which conversations reveal a school's true culture? Can you think about what factors contribute to school culture? And can you think about, can we categorise these factors at all? And I think that what happens when people do this is they start to realise that focusing on school culture isn't about what you do in schools, it's about how. So I mentioned before I was a primary school principal, and this is day one at Rosebery Primary School. I got to open a brand new primary school, which is pretty cool. And I was about to say good morning to them, but I realised at the start of the day that just as I walked down, I took this photo and I walked down a couple of steps and was about to say good morning. And I realised I was about to hit them with the same good morning that every Australian primary school principal has been hitting their students with for a couple of 100 years. You know the one, it's where you go, good morning, Mr. Voigt. I just had a moment where I thought, I don't know that that's the best way to open a brand new school. So I had that moment where you don't know what to do, so you just kind of make something up. And I said, good morning, everyone. But before you say good morning, there's going to be a couple of things you'll notice about our school that are very different. There was the architecture of the school was very different. The whole educational program was very different. And I said, including the way that we say good morning at our school. And what I said was, we're going to say good morning with excitement and enthusiasm. And then we're going to clap twice. I don't know why I said clap twice, I just did. And I said, good morning, everyone, and I clapped twice. And their job was to say, good morning, Mr. Voigt, back to me, and to clap twice. And I just thought, okay, good, you know, nice, fun, happy, smiley kind of way to start the school day. But you know what, when I left Rosebery Primary School, I stayed local in Darwin for another year while I founded Real Schools. And Darwin's not a big place, perhaps, you know, not dissimilar to Lithgow. And I noticed that nobody came up to me in the places that you bump into people and thanked me for the way that we handled the unique architecture or the way that we supported their kids to continue their learning, even though they faced one of the biggest risks to academic trajectory, which is being the new kid. No one thanked me for any of those big pieces of work I did. All I had was people sneaking up behind me in the freezer section of the supermarket and saying, good morning, Mr. Voigt. And it struck me that when it comes to culture, it's the little things. It's the language that is used routinely and through ritual, and it's about saying it doesn't matter what you do, it matters how you do it. And so it didn't matter that I said good morning at the start of that assembly. What had an impact was that I'd said it different. And what I've come to realise is that focusing on culture is not about saying, yes, I used that language. It's about saying, how did you do it? And can I make tweaks and adjustments in accordance with how I do things? So when things are tough in a relational system, in a relationship, when things are tricky and you've got a student, for instance, I want to get really practical with you here. When you've got a student and things are not working, or you've got a class that's not working, a really clever behavioural psychologist called Darren Hill says that there's a trade-off between conflict and trust. Not conflict in that we are fighting all the time, but conflict in we are disagreeing over big words. We have no idea what each other's talking about. And when I reflect on a time where there was high level of conflict and a low level of trust in a relationship that I was in, I would sort of talk about me as a 15-year-old and the relationship I had with my mum. So high conflict, low trust, and it was basically because I wasn't doing anything trustworthy. And what that meant was that when I walked out the door to go and spend another day at Year 9 at Frankston High School, that my mum would stop me and speak to content behaviours. And content behaviours are ridiculously specific. Mum would look at me and say, "Hey, Adam, stop." And I'll go, "What?" And she'd say, "When you get home from school this afternoon, you are to put your shoes away in your bedroom, so we don't have a debacle of you looking for your shoes like we did this morning. You are to put your bag away, you are to mow the lawn, and you are to do 30 minutes of homework. And only then are you allowed to go over the street and play cricket with Brett Chard." I'll go, "Yes, Mum, all right." And I'd go to walk off, and she'd say, "Stop." I'd say, "What?" And she'd say, "Tell me what you're going to do." "Oh, I'm going to put your bag away. I'm going to mow the lawn." And she'd go, "Your shoes, Adam, don't forget your shoes." I'll go, "All right, my shoes." And then I'm allowed to, then I've got to do homework, and then I can play cricket with Chardy. And she'd go, "That's right." When I got home from school that afternoon, the only thing that was an absolute certainty about my life was that there would be a note on the bench, and it would be a checklist of all the things that I was to do that afternoon. When I think about what was Mum up to, I think she was looking for a one thing that I got right, one win. She was hoping that she could get home from work, look in the backyard, see some short grass, and go, "Good job on the lawn, mate." And in that moment, my tail wags, and I get to, we get a little decrease in conflict, and a little increase in trust. There's often a little middle earth here where you can work through what Hill calls context behaviours. Context behaviours are where you can start to speak in terms of labels, but there's only 2 or 3 behaviours that it could be. So, for instance, I'm often talking about early childhood teachers and how they do this really well, because they teach inside voices to 5-year-olds. There are 3 steps to inside voices. It's put your hand up, wait to be recognised, and use the right volume, and 5-year-old boys really struggle with that. And it's only then that we can talk in terms of traits, or in schools what we call value. I'm wondering what you think would have happened if my mum had said to me, "Adam, when you go home from school this afternoon, be responsible." Most of you can probably imagine that I'm outside playing cricket. The reason for that is that we have conflict over the word responsibility. My definition of responsibility was do whatever you like, just don't break anything. Mum's was different. And for us to get agreement around those big words, responsibility, respect, empathy, trust, collaboration, the sort of things that you're looking for in your school, we need to understand that it is a failed philosophy that you can just start at the top and talk about those big words until we get agreement about the big set of behaviours that could contribute. We've got to start at the bottom. We've got to start with really specific things that we can thank and congratulate young people for, and slowly get the decrease in conflict and increase in trust that we are looking for. 2-minute chat at your table. 2-minute chat at your table. What's going through your head around Hill's model here of conflict and trust? Off you go. All right, folks, thank you so much for that. We're going to finish up in just a few minutes. Two little things that you can know about the framework that we're going to be implementing. First of all, is this notion that restorative practices has a continuum, and if we can respond consistently along that continuum, then we have a chance of dealing with the wide variety of behaviours that happen in a school, behaviours being the composer of our culture. We can deal with it consistently. We can deal at the informal end with the little things that happen crazy repetitively. So frequency at the informal end is incredibly high. Therefore, the time investment that we make needs to be incredibly low. But what I want you to know is that there's a series of things that you can do all the way along the continuum to the formal end where things are maybe a bit more serious. And I guess the point that I want to make here is that when schools look to do something around behaviour and culture they typically get too formal. They leap to the formal end. And I'm wondering, I guess, again, if you would give the people at your table a little nod, if this makes sense to you. We miss the mark when we get too formal, when we decide that what we're going to do is write policy, book PD, grab a program, buy some posters. We miss the mark because most of the interactions in a school are actually informal, not formal. They're little things. And culturally, we miss the opportunity to grow culture unless we take an informal focus. What does that informal focus look like? It starts with what we call an effective statement. So this is something that if you're looking for an entry point into the restorative framework, we're going to look deeply at that framework in the coming sessions that we'll run together. But where do you start? You can start by just using what we call effective statements. It's just a tiny change in your default. So for instance, when I get to your school, you might even hear from me that I have changed my default around a low-level behaviour such as someone dropping a piece of rubbish on the ground. So if a student in your school drops a piece of rubbish on the ground, look and nod at the people at your table if your default is something along the lines of, hey, pick that up. And most people nod and say, yeah, that's roughly what I would say. My default has changed, and it is that what I do is it costs me about a second of my time, but I will say to that student, hey, you, disappoints me to see you do that, put it in the bin. Now, if you would, I can hear you all. So on the count of three, would you tell me what's the word you heard me say the loudest? 1, 2, 3?
Disappoint.
Yeah, so if the people that did say disappoint there, what that is your limbic system working in conjunction with your neocortex. We are designed to pick up on the words of affect, or the words that teach us about feelings. We're hardwired to pick up on that. It's a teaching opportunity. Now, I think that most of you would agree that the chance of that kid picking up the paper just got a tiny, it's not huge, it's a tiny bit better by me doing that. I think you'd also agree, if you were to actually think a little bit about it, about how many opportunities there would be in a day to be able to just say what you were already going to say and just chuck in a feelings word. Most educators tell me that could possibly be up to maybe 100 or a couple of hundred times if you were able to change a default and do it with effort. If you're at the start, let's say you seized 50, in a school, and I'll just take a little stab in the dark at your school, if there were 50 people on staff, that's 2,500 opportunities a day. It's 12,500 a week. It's 125,000 a term. That's how many times it takes to be able to teach not only the young person you're talking to, but every single person who heard you say that their behaviour affects other people. That's culture. That's culture building through language. And so it starts ridiculously simply. So think, if you would, about what your defaults are. Develop a little bank of effective statements. You're going to get sick. I know what my default effective statements are. I'm telling kids constantly that I'm disappointed and I need to think of other words from time to time. And I'm also thinking about ways that I can step away from my positive default, which is impressed. I'm always telling students that I'm impressed with what you're doing there. That's very impressive, and that's, I don't know, good. I've got to think of some other words, because when you demonstrate those words, when you model that level of empathy, you build for your students a higher level of emotional vocab. When they have a higher level of emotional vocab, they're more able to articulate and more confident to step into a restorative conversation when they've done the wrong thing. It's a hugely important thing. If you can step up to that, then you're doing a great thing. And what I'm going to do is leave you today with a bit of a glimpse at what's the mirror. What's the mirror that we're going to use to reflect on the way that we work? And it's this one here. It's called the Restorative Operating Domains. And what we're going to do is we'll go into detail another time about what these words actually mean, but I wanted to just put it in front of you because, you know what, for me, most people I work with, if I ask them to think about who was the best teacher you ever had when you were at high school, most people would describe the person whose face you've conjured right now as being firm and fair. But they weren't one or the other. They weren't one over the other. They were able to hit a really clever relational balance. The people that are overly firm tend to do things to students. They get a bit nasty, a little bit punitive, a little bit power hungry. It's possible to go to low and low, which means you go to the not box. You're not doing much at all in that box. And I guess I sometimes look at that box, and because it's a quadrant model, and the bottom left box is always the one that's horrible. We tend to look at that box with disdain, but the truth is we all go there. We all occasionally, cruise out the last 15 minutes of a lesson because I just can't do any more and it's Friday afternoon. So it's just a matter of knowing that reflection is not an act of judgment. Reflection is an act of adjustment. It's knowing why I went there, knowing that there are two reasons you leave the with box, and that is because you made a mistake or because you had to. And sometimes you had to go somewhere else. If you're too fair, there's too much love, hug, support, encouragement, nurturing, then you find yourself doing things for the students. You find yourself lowering expectations and falling for excuses. But we're just going to target with monotonous regularity the with box. I reflect on this, and I will today. Every time I run any sort of workshop, any time I teach a lesson in a school, I have a 10-second rule about getting to my car because I believe that you're not reflective unless you actually make reflection a habit. And so I have a 10-second rule that says I need to think about these 4 boxes in the car before I can start the ignition. Where was I? Did I do this workshop to the Lithgow crew today? Did I do it to them? Hit them with lots of really hard, uncompromising stuff and expect them to work it out? Did I not do much at all by playing lots of videos and just get through to 5 o'clock? Did I do it for them by saying, well, everything that you're doing is fine, don't worry about improvement? Or did I put some challenging stuff in front of you and try to create an environment where you were supported enough to make important decisions? And I find that sometimes I go, yeah, you might have got a little hard ass there on them. You need to put in a couple more of those 3-minute discussions so that people can make sense of this work. And I adjust accordingly. You don't get the benefit, but the next people I work with do. Hopefully that's you on the next webinar. And that's okay, because as educators, we should be interested in continuous improvement as well. We'll do some more work on this as we go, but I did want to make sure that before we finish today, I give you a little glimpse of it. So I want you to know that you are supported from this moment on. So if you head to realschools.com.au, if you go to the website realschools.com.au, you'll see a member login tab. And if you head to the member login tab and use that password, login and password Lithgow HS there, if you use that as both the username and the password, you'll be able to get into our member section. And there's just an outrageous amount of resources. There's reading materials, there's articles for teachers around teacher practice with links to the AITL standards, articles for cultural leaders or ambitious leaders, about around cultural leadership with links to the AITL standards and principles. There's videos, we call out staff meeting conversation starters. There's every webinar we've ever run, including some around restorative practices, if that's something you'd like to get a little head start on. So please, I just want to employ you to just go in there and do. I'm a firm believer that great teaching is 90% theft. So go steal some stuff, get in there and find some things that you can help you think and help you to be able to think in such a way that you can make some fantastic decisions about stepping forward into restorative practice. You can also follow us on Facebook. We've got about 7,500 educators and parents as well who are communicating through the Facebook community. So feel free to join us there. We'd love to have you along. You can find us on Twitter as well if that's your kind of thing as well. But the final thing I want to do today is to just point to the notion of us staying in touch. As Anne and the leadership team know, I'm fierce about this notion of partnership. And that means that all of you are in partnership from this moment on. So if you want to reach out about anything that was in the webinar today, if you've got anything that you go, just along the trip, this is making sense, but you haven't met you haven't met 9A yet, who are really giving me a hard time. Adam, have you got any ideas for troubleshooting this lot? Then I'm available to help you with that. I think that I record 3 or 4 audio messages to reply to emails every single week to teachers in partner schools all over Australia. So all you need to do is to drop a line to info@realschools.com.au there, the website, the email address you can see there. Head to the website, have a bit of a look around. Now you can give us a call too if you're looking for some help. I'm noticing that I've actually, for the first time in my life, timed this reasonably well. So I know that we're right near the end today. I do want to just thank you for your attention. I know that the webinar is a unique and sometimes a challenging medium in order for us to be able to work together. Thank you to I think we had the attendee list at one stage was out of 30 of people who were online. So I know we've got a whole heap of people in the room today. I've already seen the tweet that Anne put up with everybody in the room there today. So thank you to all of you for the attention that you did pay today. And I also just want to say if there are any other questions or statements that you want to make, now's the time to do it. Short of that, you're off the hook, and I'll let you go.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, James. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you soon. Okay, bye for now.